Welcome back to our conversation with Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard. Now, Jonathan, on October 7th, 3,000 Hamas terrorists invaded Israel. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, the agency that you worked for, is supposedly one of the best in the world. Given your background in intelligence, how did Mossad fail to know that attack was being planned?
First of all, there's a common mistake that's been disseminated that I worked for the Mossad. You can find this everywhere. I didn't. I actually worked for a very sensitive and secret espionage operation out of the military intelligence, the Kiryat here, the Pentagon. And this was part of my problem because the Mossad deeply resented me and my organization. Okay, how did it happen? It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't an oversight. Back in 1973, during the run-up to the October War, the Yom Kippur War, there was what was called a conception, or in Hebrew, conceptia, that war would not occur unless certain boxes were checked. For example, until the Egyptians in particular had deep strike aircraft like the Phantom, or ballistic missiles with high degrees of accuracy, things like that. There were boxes. And if those boxes weren't checked, then war was not going to happen. Despite the fact in 73, we had a spy. It was Nasser's son-in-law, who was reporting quite accurately that war is coming. And, look at the exercises, look at the planning, look what they're doing. And people just were blinded by self-doubt. On the day of the war, when everybody realized that war was inevitable, it was coming, it was within hours, and the Air Force in particular wanted to launch a preemptive strike, Golda Meir said no because Henry Kissinger had threatened her by telling her that if you do strike preemptively, we will not support you. You have to absorb the first strike. Since 73, what had been a very offensive-oriented army suddenly became very defensive in nature. The notion of preemption or even prevention was thrown out, doctrinally was thrown out the window. And in its place, we had things like the euphemisms were mowing the grass.
I remember hearing that.
Kicking the can down the road, managing the enemy. The notion of decisive war was completely banished. When I first came here, I gave a few lectures. And I asked a bunch of generals for their definition of victory, a simple war college type definition. And I only got one guy to raise his hand, and he said, whatever the government says it is. And I said, that's wrong. That's not a professional answer. It's a political answer. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for a professional answer. So this rot just kept spreading to the point where we kept fighting Hamas over and over again, and they kept improving. And they were firing more and more missiles at our Iron Dome batteries. Why? They were trying to figure out how many missiles it would take to overwhelm them. And most of us knew that. So there was a conceptia with regard to Hamas that they were just like, well, businessmen. They were, you could buy them off. They weren't interested in really fighting. They were interested in occasionally waging a rocket war and then getting money from Qatar and getting on with their sordid lives. at the time, starting 3 years ago when I came here, I was telling people, you've got it wrong. These guys are serious. And then this whole notion of a multi-front war came up from the Iranians, that we would be hit simultaneously by the Hamasniks, the Hezbollah, the Iranian militias in Syria, and an uprising in the West Bank, in the territories, by the terrorists and by the Palestinian Authority, Preventive Security Service, the PSF. And nobody could figure out what to do about this here. And I started writing a lot of things openly, publicly, saying we have to start eliminating the various fronts, because if we don't, we're going to be overwhelmed. And people called me alarmist. I wasn't the only one writing these things, but because of my notoriety, I was like a lightning rod, which was, the way it was. So I had suggested 3 years ago a war plan against Gaza that required about 4 different types of conventional weapons that would be used over the course of a week, that would, after warning the civilians in Gaza to get someplace, would completely level the strip from one end to the other, and would allow us then to occupy and annex the strip, and then redeploy the bulk of the troops to the north to deal with Hezbollah. I have talked to a lot of evacuees from the south in hotels right around where I live.
I want to be clear. You mean evacuees from Israel who left their homes in the north because they're worried about Hezbollah?
No. There are 2 groups of evacuees. Ones that were evacuated from the north, and ones that were evacuated from the south.
Yes, but again, it's Israeli evacuees. We're not talking about Gaza.
Israelis. It's over 150,000 minimum. So I talked to a lot of them here in Jerusalem, in Yerushalayim, and I asked them a very simple question. I said, would you go back to your homes and feel safe if there were Arabs still living in Gaza? And they said, no, we would not. And these are, for the most part, very left-wing Israelis. And I said, what would make you feel safe? And they said, the total depopulation of the Strip and its annexation by Israel. Then we would sleep at night. We do not believe in offense anymore. We do not believe in our army anymore. And we do not believe that our government will tell the truth, even if they saw another October 7th happening out of Gaza. That's how bad it is here. So how did it happen? Hubris, narcissism, criminal stupidity, and this notion that technology could substitute for understanding the enemy and for Mark I eyeballs. The women observers, especially on the border, for months were calling in reports saying they're getting ready for war.
I had no idea. We have,
and
I pay attention. I pay attention to the media and read everything about this. There was no report of that in the American press.
There were tons of reports that were not only overlooked. Why? Well, I mean, I hate to be misogynist. I mean, I hate to support this notion of misogyny here, but it was because there were women reporting it. The observers were almost 100% women, and they reported accurately and correctly what was happening and what was coming. And one group of observers was actually threatened by the current commander of the South this guy Finkelman, who should be in jail right now for dereliction of duty, they were actually threatened with imprisonment if they kept complaining about these exercises that were happening. He actually threatened them with imprisonment if they didn't shut up.
Wow.